6 months, Walter, maybe less. You'll be in a wheelchair.
I built all this for my family.
You're giving everything to Diane?
No, I'm giving it to the one who showed up.
I've spent 25 years building my own company.
And how many hours did you spend building this family?
Tell me the truth. How much debt are you hiding?
Every time you called me, I thought you missed your father.
Turns out you only missed my bank account.
Then why didn't you trust me enough to tell me? Mom gave me money for 10 years. She knew about my gambling.
Why you was afraid of losing a father? Why didn't you ever ask about the money?
Because I wasn't worried about the inheritance. I was worried about you.
Do you regularly check in on your parents? Is their health really okay? Do you pay much attention to the wealth or inheritance your parents may leave behind? Or are you standing on your own 2 feet? Everyone grows old eventually, and the time a family spends together is one of the greatest blessings in this world. Always stay united and love one another. That is the message of this story. Please watch this video until the end, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.
Walter Brennan owned 850 acres of Illinois farmland, a controlling stake in 3 grain cooperatives, and a net worth that would have made most bankers in the state stand up straighter when he walked into a room. And on a Tuesday evening in March, he ate dinner alone, standing at his kitchen counter, eating reheated meatloaf out of a glass container, because sitting down at the table felt like admitting how big and how empty the house had become. Maggie had been dead for 13 months. The kitchen still had her handwriting on it, a grocery list stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like an ear of corn, half the items crossed out in blue ink, the other half never bought because she'd run out of time. Walter had not taken it down. He told himself he kept forgetting. That was a lie he was getting better at telling, even to himself. He had built an empire for a family that no longer came to see it. That was the thing nobody warned you about wealth. It didn't buy you company. It bought you phone calls that started with, "Hey Dad, quick question," and ended with a number attached. It bought you children who knew the difference between a trust and an LLC, but couldn't remember the last time they'd asked how you were sleeping. Walter set down his fork. His lower back had been screaming at him since October, a deep, grinding ache that no longer responded to ibuprofen, and 3 weeks ago Dr. Patricia and Gwen had finally put a name to it that he didn't like hearing out loud: advanced degenerative osteoporosis, compounded by spinal stenosis, the kind of diagnosis that came with phrases like limited mobility, and 6 to 12 months before wheelchair dependent, and "I'm sorry, Walter, this isn't something we reverse." He had not told his children yet. On the desk in his study sat a letter he'd started 11 times. "To my children," was as far as he ever got before the words turned to ash in his hands, and he balled up the paper and threw it toward the wastebasket, more often than not missing. He didn't know yet what he was going to do about any of it. But something in him had started moving, the way a man moves toward a decision long before his mind admits he's made one. 45 years earlier, Walter Brennan had married Margaret Okafor Brennan in a small Baptist church outside Springfield, with 60 people in the pews and a reception in the church basement, with folding tables and a sheet cake from the Piggly Wiggly. He was 23. She was 21, the daughter of Nigerian immigrants who'd settled in Decatur and built a small dry goods store from nothing, and she had a head for numbers that made the men at the county co-op uncomfortable because she was always right. They started with 40 rented acres and a tractor that broke down more than it ran. Maggie kept the books. Walter worked the fields until his hands bled and then kept working. By the time their first son was born, they had 80 acres of their own. By the time their last child came, they had 300. Margaret was the one who insisted, year after year, that the operation diversify: grain, then soybeans, then a stake in the regional co-op, then majority ownership of it. Within 20 years, Brennan Family Farms wasn't a farm anymore, so much as an institution, and Walter Brennan was a name that opened doors in Springfield and Chicago alike. They raised 4 children inside that growth, and growth has a way of teaching a family the wrong lessons if nobody's watching closely enough. Marcus came first, sharp-eyed and impatient even as a boy, the kind of child who corrected the teacher's math homework in front of the class. He left for the University of Illinois at 18 and never spent another planning season on Brennan land. He built a career in regional investment banking, eventually running his own boutique firm in Chicago, Brennan Kessler Capital Partners, handling portfolios for men who, in Marcus's quiet estimation, weren't nearly as wealthy as his own father, though none of them knew it. Derek came 2 years after, all charm and big plans, the kind of kid who sold lemonade at a markup to other kids' parents. He chased a restaurant empire through his 30s, a steakhouse concept called Prairie and Ember, that had 3 locations across central Illinois at its peak and was now hemorrhaging money on an expansion into Indianapolis that Derek had personally guaranteed, with a loan he hadn't told anyone about. Tyler came third, quieter, the kind of middle child who learned early that the only way to get attention in a house full of achievers was to need rescuing. He'd been in and out of community college, in and out of jobs at his brother's companies that always ended badly, and for the past decade, in and out of something darker that nobody in the family said out loud, a gambling habit that had eaten through 3 separate loans from his mother that Walter didn't know about and wouldn't find out about until it was almost too late to matter. And then there was Diane, born when Maggie was 34, the surprise Maggie always called her best one. Diane grew up with dirt under her fingernails and her mother's ledgers spread across the kitchen table, learning the difference between a futures contract and a forward contract before she learned to drive. She built Heartland Harvest Logistics out of a single refrigerated truck and a stubborn belief that Midwest grain and produce deserved better distribution than the brokers were giving small operations. And 15 years later, her company moved product for 40 family farms across 6 states, with contracts reaching grocery chains from Ohio to California. Margaret was the thread that held the 4 of them together, the way mothers like her always are in families like this. She remembered birthdays without being reminded. She drove to Chicago when Marcus's first marriage fell apart and sat in his kitchen until he talked about it. She wired Derek money when Prairie and Ember nearly folded in 2019, money Walter still didn't know about. She quietly, secretly, again and again, bailed Tyler out of debts that had names like Marker and Vig that she never explained to her husband because she was afraid of what he'd do and afraid of what it would mean if he stopped loving their son the way she still did, helplessly, completely. Walter provided. Margaret connected. That was the arrangement. It worked, in its way, for 45 years, until it didn't have to work anymore, because Margaret was gone, and there was no one left translating Walter's silences into love his children could recognize. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday in November, 8 months after a routine mammogram turned into something else entirely. Stage 4 lung cancer, metastasized, the oncologist said it in a beige room that smelled like hand sanitizer, and Margaret had squeezed Walter's hand once, hard, and then asked what the treatment timeline looked like, because that was who she was. She organized even her own dying the way she organized Thanksgiving. She fought for 8 months. Chemotherapy, and then a clinical trial, and then, near the end, just comfort care and a hospital bed moved into the front parlor so she could see the fields from the window. The children came, but not equally. Marcus flew in from Chicago twice in 8 months, each visit under 36 hours, each one bookended by calls he took standing in the hallway with the door half closed. Derek came more often, but always seemed to be passing through. He'd stop for an hour on his way to a supplier meeting in St. Louis, kiss his mother's forehead, and be gone before dinner. Tyler's visits had a different texture entirely. He came when he needed something, sat by her bed, with his knee bouncing, and more than once Margaret sent him home with an envelope that Walter assumed, when he noticed it all, was just grocery money. Diane drove the 2 hours from her distribution hub in Bloomington every single weekend, without exception, and some weeks she didn't go home at all. She read to her mother from the paperback mysteries on the shelf by the window. She learned to give the injections the hospice nurse taught her, because she wanted her mother handled by someone who loved her, not just someone who was paid to. Margaret died on a Thursday morning in June, with the soybeans just starting to canopy in the fields outside her window. Walter was holding her hand. He kept holding it for almost an hour, after the machines confirmed what he already knew. 400 people came to the funeral. Walter sat in the front pew between his children and absorbed almost none of the service. Afterward, in the parking lot of First Baptist, he watched Marcus standing near a man in an expensive overcoat who did not belong to anyone in the family, and caught fragments of a sentence. Agricultural land valuations in this corridor, before Marcus noticed his father watching, and ended the conversation abruptly. Derek spent the reception working the room like it was a soft opening, shaking hands, accepting condolences with a practiced warmth that made several women remark on what a strong family the Brennans were. He left before the last guests did, citing a flight he needed to catch for the Indianapolis thing. Tyler found Walter near the coat room and, with his eyes down, asked quietly whether the life insurance paperwork had been started yet. Walter said he hadn't gotten to it. Tyler nodded like a man absorbing a blow he'd expected and didn't say anything else. Diane found her father in the kitchen, standing at the sink, with the water running and nothing in his hands. She turned off the faucet, took his hand, and stood with him in silence until he was ready to walk back out, into the noise of people offering casseroles and condolences in equal measure. That was the funeral. That was what Walter saw, even if he didn't yet have the language to name the pattern. The 13 months that followed confirmed everything the funeral had suggested, one quiet data point at a time. Marcus called roughly once a month, and the calls were never long. He asked about the co-op's quarterly numbers more often than he asked about his father's health. In February, he mentioned, almost in passing, the way a man mentions something he's been sitting on, that he'd had a colleague run comparables on agricultural land values in the corridor between Springfield and Bloomington. Just out of curiosity, Dad, given how the market's moving. Derek called when Prairie and Ember needed something. In September, it was 4 months. In December, it was the Indianapolis lease he'd personally guaranteed, the one that was now $11,000 past due, and Derek's voice on the phone had a brightness to it that didn't match the words, the verbal equivalent of a man smiling too hard at a job interview he badly needed to land. Walter wired the money. He told himself it was, because that's what fathers do. Tyler didn't call much at all, which Walter, in his grief, mistook for respect rather than what it actually was. A man too ashamed to dial the number, sitting on a debt to a private lender in Peoria that had gone from $4,000 to almost $30,000 in 18 months of interest he didn't understand and was too frightened to explain to anyone. Diane came every week, or when distribution season made that impossible, every 2 to 3 weeks, without fail, always with a call ahead of time, always arriving with something from her own supply chain, sweet corn in August, a case of the maple syrup she sourced from a Wisconsin partner farm in October, simply because she knew her father liked it on his oatmeal and would never buy it for himself. She cooked dinner in the kitchen that still smelled faintly like her mother's hand cream. She noticed, in January, the way Walter winced getting up from a kitchen chair and didn't say anything that night, but called Dr. Nguyen's office herself the next morning to move up an appointment that Walter had been quietly putting off for 6 weeks. She noticed the pill bottle under his pillow in February, not painkillers prescribed by a doctor, but the over-the-counter kind, taken in quantities that worried her, and she didn't lecture him. She just started bringing a weekly pill organizer with her, filling it herself every visit, watching to see if it emptied on schedule. She never once asked about the will. She never asked what the farm was worth, or what her share might look like, or whether Walter had started thinking about that side of things. She asked if he was eating. She asked if he was lonely. When he said he was fine, she said, "I don't believe you, Dad, but I love you anyway." The exact cadence Margaret used to use, and Walter heard his dead wife's voice come out of his living daughter's mouth and had to leave the room. By March, Dr. Nguyen's prognosis had hardened into something Walter could no longer negotiate with. Standing more than 20 minutes at a stretch was agony. A wheelchair, she told him plainly, was 6 months away, maybe less if he kept pushing through the pain the way he had his whole life. Walter, she said, you need to get your affairs in order. Not because you're dying tomorrow. Because you need to make these decisions while you're still entirely yourself, and not later when the pain medication makes that harder. He drove home, that evening past fields just starting to green, the grain elevators of his own cooperative rising gray against the sky, and he understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after months of dread, exactly what he was going to do. Carl Whitfield had handled Brennan family legal matters since 1991, ever since Walter had walked into his storefront office on the Springfield Square needing help incorporating the co-op stake. Carl was 70 now himself, silver-haired and unhurried, and he listened to Walter's plan on a Thursday afternoon, without writing anything down for the first 10 minutes. You want to move everything into a trust, Carl said finally, before the boys even know you're sick. I want to know what's true before 4 lawyers and 40 years of resentment get involved. Walter said, I've watched Maggie hold this family together with string and grace for 45 years, Carl. She's not here to do it anymore. If I don't do this now, while I can still think straight, somebody is going to do it for me later, and it won't be done with love. And the structure? Walter had thought about this longer than Carl knew. Everything goes into the Brennan family trust and holdings. The land, the co-op stake, the equipment, all of it. Diane runs it. She's the only one of the 4 who's ever shown up for this family without being asked what was in it for her, and she's the only one who actually knows how to run an agricultural operation without losing money doing it. And the boys? Each of them gets 15% of annual distributions. Diane gets 55% and full operating control as trustee and CEO. Carl set his pen down. That's not an equal split, Walter. You understand what that's going to look like to Marcus. It's not supposed to be equal, Walter said. It's supposed to be true. He called the 4 of them himself, one by one, on a Sunday evening in April, and asked them to come home the following Saturday. He didn't tell them why. He didn't need to. The silences on the other end of each call told him almost everything he needed to know before he'd even hung up. Marcus's first question was not about his father's health. Is this about the estate plan, Dad? Because if it is, I'd like to bring someone who can look at the documents with me. Derek's voice brightened in a way that made Walter's chest hurt. Saturday? Yeah, of course. Hey, actually, is there any chance we could talk numbers before then? Just so I know what I'm working with for some financing conversations. Tyler asked, quietly, almost too quietly to hear whether there'd be anything available before then, just to tide things over. Diane asked, Is everything okay, Dad? You sound tired. And when he told her he was fine, she said, I don't believe you. I'm coming Wednesday too, not just Saturday. Walter hung up the phone in his study and sat for a long time looking at the letter he still hadn't finished writing. Marcus Brennan did not wait until Saturday. By Tuesday morning, he had retained Sandra Pierce, a Chicago estate litigator whose firm specialized, the website said it delicately, in complex high-net-worth succession disputes. Marcus told himself this was prudent due diligence, the same instinct that had made him successful in finance. Get ahead of risk before it materializes. He told himself it had nothing to do with the fact that his father's tone on the phone had sounded like a man who'd already made up his mind about something, and that something had clearly not been run past his eldest son first. I just want to understand the landscape, Marcus told Sandra over a call from his office on the 41st floor of a building on LaSalle Street. My father's 74. He's been alone since my mother passed. I don't know what kind of decisions he's capable of making clearly right now, and I want to know our options if this doesn't look the way it should. Sandra Pierce had handled enough of these calls to recognize the shape of the conversation immediately, a son dressing up fear of being overlooked as concern for his father's welfare, and she did what good lawyers do. She didn't correct the framing, because the framing was useful to her business. Get me his recent medical records, if you can, she said, and anything in writing, emails, texts, anything that shows his state of mind over the last year. If there's a capacity question here, we want to document it now, not after the fact. Marcus told himself he was just being thorough. Saturday arrived clear and unseasonably warm for April, the kind of sky that made the bare fields look like they were holding their breath before planting. Walter had Carl Whitfield's paralegal lay the documents out on the dining room table the night before: the trust agreement, the distribution schedule, the operating structure that would make his 38-year-old daughter the head of an agricultural enterprise worth more than most of the men who doubted her over the years could imagine. Marcus arrived first, alone, in a charcoal suit that had clearly not been chosen with a farmhouse in mind. He hugged his father stiffly at the door and immediately scanned the dining room table the way he scanned a balance sheet, looking for the bottom line, before he'd even sat down. Derek arrived 20 minutes later, talking before he was fully through the door, something about a supplier deal in Indianapolis that was this close to working out if the timing on a few other things lined up. He looked thinner than the last time Walter had seen him, and there was a brittleness under the charm that Walter, distracted by his own pain, did not fully register. Tyler arrived last, parking his 10-year-old pickup at an angle near the barn, sitting in the cab for almost a full minute before he climbed out. He came in quietly, shoulders rounded, and took the seat closest to the door, as if he might need to leave quickly. Diane was already there. She'd come Wednesday like she said she would, and again Friday night, and she'd spent the morning in the kitchen, Margaret's kitchen, making a pot roast that filled the house with a smell none of them had experienced inside these walls in over a year. They gathered around the dining room table, where Margaret used to referee homework arguments and Thanksgiving seating charts. Walter sat at the head, his cane hooked over the back of the chair, and Carl Whitfield stood near the window with a folder under his arm, ready but not yet needed. "I'm sick," Walter said, and the room went still in the particular way a room goes still when the worst sentence anyone expected turns out not to be the one that's coming next. "My spine is failing. I'll likely be in a wheelchair by fall. I am not dying tomorrow, but I am no longer capable of running this operation, and I am not going to pretend otherwise for one more season." Derek's face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds: shock, then something that looked almost like relief, then visible shame at his own relief. Tyler stared at the tablecloth. Marcus's jaw set in a way Walter recognized from his own mirror. "So I've made a decision," Walter continued, "about how this family's future gets structured, and I want to tell you myself, today, before any of you hear a version of it secondhand." He looked directly at Marcus when he said that, and something in Marcus's expression flickered, a flash of "he knows," that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. Carl stepped forward and laid out the trust documents. Everything, the land, the cooperative stake, the equipment, all 850 acres, goes into the Brennan Family Trust and Holdings. Walter said, "Diane will be CEO and trustee. Full operating control." The room absorbed this in silence for exactly 4 seconds. "And the distributions?" Marcus's voice was even, controlled, the voice he used when a deal was about to go sideways, and he needed everyone to think he wasn't worried. "Diane receives 55% of annual net distributions." Walter said, "Each of you receives 15. Derek did the math out loud, without meaning to. 15% of that's. He stopped himself, but everyone at the table had already watched him reach for a calculator that wasn't there, and Walter felt something in his chest crack quietly at the sight of it. Marcus stood up, so fast his chair scraped against the hardwood. "You're giving her 55% and operating control of an estate worth. Dad, do you understand what you're doing? I run a financial firm. I have the literal expertise to manage this, and you're handing it to." He stopped himself before he finished the sentence, but the unfinished half hung in the room anyway, ugly and audible. "To her, to the youngest, to the girl, to the one who showed up." Walter said quietly, "That's not a math problem, Marcus. I didn't divide this by birth order or by who has the fanciest office. I divided it by who was actually here. That's not fair," Marcus said. "You can't measure a person's worth to this family by how many Tuesday dinners they happen to make." "I'm not measuring worth," Walter said, "I'm measuring trust. And I have 13 months of evidence, son, written down in your mother's planner on her phone before she died, going back years. Before that, patterns she saw and tried to tell me about, and I didn't listen to, until it was too late to fix, while she was still here to help me fix it." Tyler's head came up sharply at the mention of the planner. Something crossed his face, not surprise exactly. Recognition. Fear. Diane sat very still, watching her brothers absorb a number that was, in its way, also a verdict. Marcus did not say much for the rest of that visit. He left within the hour, citing a Monday closing he needed to prepare for, and the handshake he gave his father at the door was the handshake of a man closing a transaction he intended to revisit. By Monday morning, he had instructed Sandra Pierce to file a petition challenging the trust on grounds of diminished testamentary capacity, citing Walter's pain medication regimen, his recent diagnosis, and this was the part that made Carl Whitfield's jaw tighten when he heard about it from a contact at the county clerk's office. A documented pattern of favoritism inconsistent with the decedent's historical estate planning, as though Walter were already dead, and being spoken of in the third person, a man reduced to a legal abstraction by his own son. Derek, 4 days behind on the Indianapolis lease, and watching Prairie and Ember's third location post its worst month in company history, took Marcus's call on a Tuesday night standing in his restaurant's empty walk-in cooler, so his staff wouldn't hear the conversation. "I don't love this, Marcus. Nobody loves it. But if the court agrees the trust structure was improperly influenced, we go back to an equal four-way split of the estate under intestacy guidelines, or close to it. That's roughly 23% of the operating value each, instead of 15% of annual distributions under Diane's management. You do that math, Derek. You know which number you need." Derek didn't know which number he needed. He'd known it for months, the way a drowning man knows the distance to shore, without needing to measure it. "What do you need from me?" "Just don't contradict the filing if Sandra's team asks you anything. That's all. You don't even have to say anything affirmative. Just don't get in the way." Derek said okay. He hated himself a little for saying it. In a part of his chest he didn't examine too closely. And then he went back out, onto the restaurant floor, and smiled at a table of regulars like nothing in his life was unraveling at all. Sandra Pierce's investigative team, building the capacity case, pulled 18 months of Walter's pharmacy records, his doctor's notes, and, because attorneys in cases like this leave no financial stone unturned, 3 years of banking records belonging not just to Walter, but to the joint accounts he'd shared with Margaret before her death. It was a junior associate named Priya Raman who found it on a Thursday afternoon, cross-referencing wire transfers against a private lending entity in Peoria that did not show up in any public business registry under a name that meant anything to her until she traced the LLC back through a UCC filing to its registered agent, and the registered agent's only other listed client was a name she recognized. From the case file, Tyler Brennan. The transfers went back 9 years. For $1,000 in 2017, $6,000 in 2019, $11,000 in a single 8-month stretch in 2022, the same 8 months Margaret had been undergoing chemotherapy. Money moved from a joint account in increments small enough that Walter, exhausted and frightened, and focused entirely on his wife's survival, had simply never noticed. $29,000 total, across 9 years, paid quietly by Margaret Brennan to a man who turned out, on closer inspection by Priya's research, to be exactly what the family had always politely declined to say out loud about the people Tyler owed money to. Sandra brought the discovery to Marcus on a Friday, framing it the way a litigator frames anything, as leverage. "This actually helps the capacity argument," she said. "If we can show your mother was making large, undisclosed financial decisions toward the end of her life, possibly under duress, or to manage a family member's undisclosed crisis, it supports a broader narrative that financial decision-making in this family over the last several years has been opaque and potentially compromised. It's not directly about your father, but it muddies the waters around how clear-eyed decision-making in this family actually looks." Marcus sat with the printout for a long time after Sandra left his office. He had wanted ammunition against his father's competence. What he'd gotten instead was a window into his mother's loneliest secret, and beneath the part of him still thinking like a litigant, something older and rawer recoiled at what he was holding. He should have called Walter. He should have called Tyler. Instead, almost on autopilot, the way men do things they're not proud of, when they've already crossed one line and the second one no longer feels as far away, Marcus forwarded the file to Derek with a single line. We might have more leverage than we thought. Call me. Diane found out a different way, and it found her first. Heartland Harvest Logistics had, 11 years earlier, helped broker a hardship arrangement for a small produce operation near Peoria that was behind on equipment financing. Paperwork Diane herself had signed off on, as a courtesy to a struggling farmer she respected, paperwork that, buried 3 layers down in an old file she pulled up, while doing something completely unrelated, listed a private lender as a guarantor on the note. The same lender, the same registered agent, a name that, when she finally let herself really look at it, made the floor of her office tilt slightly beneath her. She drove to Springfield that night without calling first, sat in her car outside Tyler's apartment for 20 minutes before she had the nerve to go up, and when he opened the door and saw her face, he knew immediately that whatever this visit was, it wasn't a casual one. You knew, she said, not as an accusation, just as a fact she needed him to confirm. About the money. Mom's money. Tyler's whole body seemed to fold inward, the way a man's does, when a wound he spent years hiding gets touched directly for the first time. He didn't try to deny it. He sat down heavily on the arm of his couch and put his face in his hands and, for a long time, didn't say anything at all. $29,000. Diane said quietly, sitting down across from him. Tyler, that's not a loan. That's a person drowning, and Mom holding her breath underwater, with you for 9 years, so nobody else would see. I know what it is, Tyler said, and his voice cracked on the last word. I've known what it is every single day since she died, and I didn't have her to call anymore when it got bad again. Is it still happening? A long silence. I haven't placed a bet in 14 months. He said, since the week before the funeral. I went to a meeting. I've been going every week since. He looked up at her, eyes red. I never told anyone that either. What was the point? Nobody was going to believe Tyler Brennan finally got serious about something. Diane sat with that for a moment, feeling the shape of a choice settling onto her shoulders that she hadn't asked for and couldn't put down. She now knew something that, if surfaced the wrong way, in the wrong room, in front of the wrong lawyer, could be twisted into evidence against her mother's judgment, her father's awareness, and her brother's character, all at once. Exactly the kind of mess Sandra Pierce's filing was hungry for. She also knew, with equal clarity, that if she said nothing, and Marcus's legal team found this on their own and weaponized it in a courtroom, it would destroy Tyler far more thoroughly than the truth, told with care, ever could. I'm not going to use this against you, she finally said, and I'm not going to let Marcus use it either. But Tyler, you have to be the one who tells Dad. Not me, not a lawyer's filing. You. He'll never look at me the same. Maybe not. Diane said, but right now he doesn't really know you at all, because you've spent 10 years making sure nobody could see the real thing. That's worse than him being disappointed in something true. The court date for the initial capacity hearing was set for the second Saturday in June, but Sandra Pierce's office had scheduled a settlement conference at the farmhouse 3 days before that, an attempt, she'd told Marcus, to gauge whether the family could resolve this. Without the expense and exposure of open court, though what she really wanted was a read on Walter in person, before deciding how hard to push. Marcus arrived with Sandra, a stack of filings, and an expression that had hardened sometime between April and June into something Walter almost didn't recognize as his son's face. Derek arrived separately, 10 minutes late, looking like he hadn't slept properly in a month. Tyler arrived in his truck, parked it, and sat in the cab for nearly 5 minutes before Diane walked out to the porch, saw him sitting there, and simply waited, arms crossed, until he found the nerve to get out. They gathered, again, around the kitchen table, Margaret's table. In Margaret's kitchen, the smell of coffee Diane had started brewing at 6, that morning still hanging in the room. Sandra opened with the formal language lawyers use to make ugly things sound procedural. Capacity concerns, fiduciary obligations, a fair and equitable resolution that protects all parties' interests, and Walter let her finish, without interrupting, his hands flat on the table, his face unreadable. When she finished, Walter looked at his eldest son. "You filed papers saying I don't know my own mind, Marcus." "I filed papers asking a court to look at the circumstances under which a major decision was made, Dad." "That's not the same as." "It's exactly the same," Walter said, and his voice, though quiet, carried a steadiness that made even Sandra Pierce go still. "You sat at this table in April and watched me tell you I have months before I lose the use of my legs. And within 72 hours you had a lawyer building a case that I'm not fit to decide who runs the company I built with my own 2 hands and your mother's mind for 45 years. Tell me honestly, is this about whether I'm capable, or is this about the number on the page?" Marcus's mouth opened, and for a moment nothing came out at all. It was Derek who broke first, and not in the direction Sandra Pierce had spent weeks preparing for. "It's the number," Derek said, quietly, to the table rather than to anyone in particular. "For me, anyway, I'm not going to sit here and pretend it's about Dad's mental state. I'm 4 months behind on a lease I personally guaranteed, and I have been since January, and Marcus told me an equal split under intestacy gets me back to even, and 15% of distributions doesn't, and I said okay, because I am scared out of my mind, and I have been scared out of my mind since before Mom even got sick, and I never told a single person in this family, because I built a steakhouse empire on Instagram, and I could not stand for any of you to know it was actually failing." The room went silent in a different way than it had in April. Marcus stared at his brother, with something between fury and a kind of vertigo, the sensation of watching his own carefully built argument get pulled out from under him by the one person he'd assumed would simply stay quiet. "Derek," Sandra started. "I'm not finished," Derek said, and something in his voice, a roughness that hadn't been there a moment ago, made even Sandra stop. "Dad, I'm sorry. I should have called you in February when the bank started calling me. I should have told you the truth instead of asking for wires and letting you think it was for inventory. I used Mom's death as leverage in this filing because I was drowning, and I am ashamed of that, and I'm pulling out." Tyler had been silent through all of it, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past his father's shoulder, and when he finally spoke, his voice shook so badly the first few words were almost inaudible. "There's something else," he said. "Something Sandra's team found that they haven't told you about yet, Dad, because they were saving it. I'd rather you hear it from me." Walter's hands, flat on the table, went very still. "Mom gave me money," Tyler said, "for 10 years. Almost $30,000 in pieces, because I have a gambling problem I have never once said out loud in this house, until right now. She paid off a lender in Peoria 3 separate times, so I wouldn't end up, so nothing worse would happen to me. The last time was while she was getting chemo. She used the joint account. You never knew, because she made sure you never knew, because she was trying to protect both of us. Me, from what I'd done, and you from having to choose between loving me and being furious with me at the same time she was dying." Walter did not move for a long moment. Diane, watching her father's face, saw something pass through it that she recognized from the week after the funeral, that specific, wordless devastation of learning the dead still had things left to tell you. 14 months sober from it, Tyler added, his voice barely holding. "Since right before the funeral. I go to meetings every week. I never told anyone, because I didn't think anyone would believe it mattered, coming from me." Sandra Pierce, sensing the room had moved entirely outside the boundaries of any filing she'd prepared, said nothing, for once entirely, without a script. Marcus sat back in his chair, the fight visibly draining out of him, replaced by something that looked, for the first time in months, like grief rather than strategy. "You used Mom," he said to Tyler, "but there was no real heat in it anymore. And I used a lawyer to go after Dad while he's dying. I don't know which of us did the worst thing." "Neither do I," Tyler said, "But I know. Which of us is finally telling the truth about it?" Walter spoke first, after a silence that stretched long enough for the coffee pot in the kitchen to click off on its own timer. "Your mother used to write things down," he said, "not to keep score. I think, looking back, she did it because she was trying to understand all of you, trying to find the language each of you actually spoke, because she knew I never learned more than one. I found notes in her planner, after, things she'd written about each of you, not accusations, just observations, the kind a person makes when they're paying closer attention than anyone around them realizes." He looked at Marcus. "She wrote that you call this family in spreadsheets, because that's the only language I ever taught you. That's true, son. I never once told you I was proud of you for building something of your own instead of staying here, because some stubborn part of me resented you for leaving, and I let that resentment sit between us for 25 years instead of saying it out loud, where it could have healed." He looked at Derek. "She wrote that you performed for rooms, because you were never sure anyone in this one was actually watching you closely enough. I wasn't, Derek. I was watching the harvest, watching the markets, watching everything except you, growing up loud enough that I assumed loud meant fine." He looked at Tyler last, and his voice, for the first time since any of them had arrived, broke slightly. "And she wrote that you scared her more than the cancer did, because she didn't know what would happen to you once she wasn't there to catch you quietly. I am sorry, Tyler. Not for the money, for the 10 years you carried. That alone, because some part of you was certain I'd love you less if I knew." "Would you have?" Tyler asked, and the question hung in the room like something fragile. Walter considered it honestly, the way he tried to consider everything now, that there wasn't much time left to waste on easy answers. "I don't know," he admitted. "I might have tried to fix it the way I fix everything, with money and silence, and a refusal to talk about feelings, which is its own kind of failure. Your mother chose a harder, quieter kind of love, the kind that costs the lover something every time. I'm only sorry I wasn't strong enough, back then, for her to trust me with it too." Sandra Pierce withdrew the petition the following Monday, citing, in language so carefully neutral it made Carl Whitfield smile when he read it. A resolution reached among the parties. Marcus paid her final invoice himself, out of personal funds, without ever telling his father what it cost him, financially or otherwise. The four siblings did not become close overnight. Grief and money, and 40 years of unspoken patterns don't dissolve in a single afternoon at a kitchen table, however honest. But something had cracked open, that Saturday that none of them were willing to let seal shut again. Marcus called his father every Sunday. After that, and the calls grew, slowly, from quarterly numbers into actual conversations, about the farm, eventually, but also about Marcus's daughter's soccer season, and once, hesitantly, about whether Walter had ever actually wanted Marcus to take over the operation, or whether some part of him had always understood his eldest son needed to build something separate from his father's shadow to ever feel like his own man. Walter told him the truth. He hadn't understood that until very recently, but he understood it now, and he was, in fact, proud. He'd just never once said the word out loud in 25 years, and he was done letting that be acceptable. Derek sold Prairie and Ember's Indianapolis lease back to the landlord at a loss he could finally afford to absorb once his 15% distribution structure was no longer a number he needed to win a lawsuit to survive, and Diane, without being asked, simply because she understood supply chains the way her mother had understood ledgers, helped him restructure his remaining 2 locations to source directly through Heartland Harvest, cutting his food costs enough that, for the first time in 3 years, Prairie and Ember turned a quarterly profit. Tyler kept going to his meetings. Diane gave him a job, not out of charity, she was careful to make clear, but a real one, managing logistics scheduling for the Peoria distribution hub, with real accountability and a real probation period, if he missed it. He didn't miss it. By August, he'd been promoted once, and he started a habit, every Sunday evening, of calling his father just to talk, the way Diane always had, the way nobody in the family had ever quite taught him to do, until he watched his sister do it for 13 straight months, without anyone asking her to. The first Sunday dinner under the new arrangement was held in July, in the farmhouse, around a table Diane had set, with Margaret's good dishes, the ones with the blue rim, that had been a wedding gift from Margaret's own mother decades before. Walter sat at the head of the table in his wheelchair now, a transition that had come faster than even Dr. Gwyn predicted, but his voice, when he spoke, hadn't lost an ounce of the weight it carried. "I didn't leave you a farm," he said, looking around the table at all four of his children and at the grandchildren scattered through the house behind them, laughing at something in the next room. "Your mother spent 45 years trying to teach me that providing and loving aren't the same verb, and I was too proud and too busy to hear her, until I had almost run out of time to do anything about it. What I'm leaving you is what's left of that lesson, that money divided by guilt or fear or fairness on paper doesn't hold a family together. Only the truth does, even when the truth is expensive to tell." He reached into his shirt pocket and drew out an old pocket watch, brass-gone soft and warm with age, the one his own grandfather had carried through 2 wars and a depression, and handed down through 3 generations of Brennan men who'd never quite known what to do with it beyond admiring it in a drawer. He set it in front of Diane. "This isn't about the 55%, he said before she could protest. "It was never about the money, for you, and we both know that. This is because for 13 months, you were the only one in this family who kept time for the rest of us, when nobody else remembered how. I want you to have it, because you earned it the only way that's ever actually mattered, by simply, stubbornly, showing up." Diane closed her hand around the watch and didn't trust herself to speak for a long moment. Outside the kitchen window, the soybeans were just beginning to canopy across the same fields, where her mother had taken her last breath 13 months before, green and steady, and entirely unconcerned with what any of them had been through to get back to this table together. "We all failed her, in our own ways," Diane finally said, looking at her brothers, not unkindly. "She held this whole family up by herself for 45 years, and none of us noticed how heavy that actually was until she wasn't here to do it anymore. I don't want to be the only one holding it now. I want us to learn how to share the weight, the way she always tried to teach us." Marcus reached for the watch when Diane set it down on the table to pass around, turned it over once in his hands, and slid it back to her, without a word. Not a transaction, not a negotiation. Just a brother, finally, handing something back to his sister because she'd earned it and meaning it. Outside, the Illinois sky was beginning to gold, over with the particular slow light of a Midwestern summer evening, and the fields, dark soil and new green in equal measure, stretched out toward a horizon none of them had built alone.